Can I get him, folks, to say the word what? I'm going to be on mission today.
I can say what?
Not the way I want you to say it, Phil. Hello, welcome to the Bible Wait.
What?
You're a disappointment. Sorry, I shouldn't say you're a disappointment. That was disappointing.
I'm taking that personally.
That was disappointing. You're not a disappointment, but I am
closing the Bible
disappointed.
and I'm going home.
I am disappointed.
Nah.
Welcome to the Bible Wait. What? I'm still a bit croaky there. It comes out every now and then. Well, Phil, we are in Hebrews 9 and off air. We just looked at it and went, we've pretty much talked about all of this in Hebrews 8 already and 7. So we're going to...
That's why you said at the end of the last episode that we were going to skip 9 and go straight to 10.
Because we didn't need... That's right. We obviously didn't... Subliminally, I knew we didn't need 9. No, we just sort of worked out a couple of thoughts we could pull out of 9 as well. And then we'll deal with one of those questions about what is sacrifice, which I think is a really valid question. I have talked about it on the podcast last year and in different contexts, so we'll get there in a minute. But he kind of just starts, doesn't he, with just out. Even though we've said at length here, he has so much assumed knowledge about how things work that we have to figure out. This is probably the one place where he actually does say, well, let me just remind you of what the old tabernacle was like. And he lists
how it was set up.
How it was all set up, what it did.
What was in there, what were the rooms, what was the holy place, the Holy of Holies, what was inside there, the ark.
So why don't you, in a simple nutshell, assuming no one's listened to anything else, and we only just alluded to it in previous chapters, in a nutshell, why don't you just tell us the process, see if you can do it in 2 minutes, the process of what it all looked like and how it all worked and what it represented. 2 minutes, go.
Okay. Old Testament temple was a place that had outside was where all the sacrifices happened, where the bulls and the sheep and everything was killed. They were washed, they were burnt, and then the blood was taken into the temple. So inside the temple was 2 rooms. One was the holy place, and then the second room was the Holy of Holies. In this holy room, there was the bread of the showbread, the menorah, the lampstand, a table, an incense altar, and where every day the priests would do their rituals. But in the Holy of Holies, which was behind a tent, behind a curtain, was the Ark of the Covenant and the mercy seat and the cherubim that was sitting over the top of it. And that's where the high priest would only go once a year with the blood of the bulls to offer their sacrifice for their everybody's sins, for the priest's sins, but also the sins of the nation. The whole place was beautiful, full of gold. Everything was laid with gold. So that's probably a snapshot.
Not bad. I reckon you did that in 75 seconds. Yeah. That's a pretty good snapshot. Of the whole process in a nutshell. Very ornate religious process. And I guess to sum it up, it was a process to show that because the Ark of the Covenant, the part where the angels were in the Holy of Holies, that was regarded as the holiest point on earth, where God dwelt between the angels, between the wings of the cherubim, these angels, was the holiest spot. And all this ritual was to remind people that you couldn't just come flippantly, willy-nilly into God's presence because of human sin, because of our failing to live up to God's standard. They had to go through this ritualistic process to remind them of that. That's the point of, and he's referring to multiple, because sacrifices were happening all the time for all kinds of reasons. There's at least 6 different types of sacrifice that are mentioned, fellowship offerings and all these different things. Some are just food, some are animals, but the big one that the writer to the Hebrews is largely, although not exclusively focusing on, is the Day of Atonement, the Day of Yom Kippur, which is a once-a-year sacrifice that you referred to, where the priest would make an offering for himself and his family. Then he would make an offering on behalf of all of the people, and that one time he would go behind that curtain and he would put that blood on that mercy seat, that which is the top of the ark. And he would do that once a year. So that's the background of the significance of it all, and what is he saying? He even says in verse 5, he explains it, the wings stretched out over the ark. He says, but we cannot explain these things in detail now. So he's even giving a summary. Yeah. His summary is similar to your summary, a 75-second summary kind of thing. But you picked up just as we were off air that verse 10, after he alludes to all of this, he explained what he says. What's his point about this summary of all this religion and processes that they went through?
Well, it says in verse 10, it says, for the old system, the old rituals, deals only with food and drink and ritual washing. These are external regulations that are only in effect until their limitations can be corrected. So all these workings that they were doing was all external. It wasn't really anything about doing an internal work of the heart. It's just ritual washings, ritual sacrifices. So it was the...
So here's where I used to think. I used to think that the fact that it was all external meant it couldn't do anything on the heart. I now don't think that's the case. Otherwise, you've got to think about the godly men and women throughout Jewish history that went to the temple to offer these sacrifices. It wasn't an empty ritual. It did do something on their heart, like as they could smell the offering being made, as they'd sit there in the temple courts. You've got to read some of those Old Testament Psalms to realize they were in touch with God.
Oh, definitely.
So it wasn't that it wasn't doing something on the heart. It's just that it wasn't doing something eternal on the heart.
Yeah.
The system was ultimately going to fall short.
Yeah.
It wasn't going to deal with, it wasn't able to deal with the ultimate problem, which was the sin that blackens humanity's heart. It could cover it over. It could kind of sweep it under the carpet, not necessarily in a bad way, but it couldn't actually take it away. It was just this annual, that's why it had to happen regularly.
It's like a Band-Aid.
It was like a Band-Aid. That's a good way to put it. Yeah, it's like that. It needed something more permanent to deal with the issue of the human heart, and that's where Jesus comes along. That's why it says a better system needed to be established. It was a good system, it just wasn't the ultimately best system.
Yeah. And I liked how you sort of said that you reminded me with that that people were doing this but still had a heart for God and doing it. There wasn't just a ritual, doing it by rote. Some yes, some not.
That's right. And that's the same today.
It is. It's definitely the same today.
Yeah.
And that's one thing when I grew up in the Anglican tradition, but in the sort of mid-high tradition where we had the candles and the colours. And when they were explained to me, it was like, these are representations pointing me to God.
So suddenly the liturgy becomes significant to you when it was explained.
Yeah.
And I would think that would be the same. There would be Jews that would just go to the temple and go through the process and missed it. And there are Christians who come to church today and go through the process, but they don't fully grasp what Jesus has done. So therefore, this is applicable to us too. Because if we think, we're just going through the motions and somehow coming to church is cutting it for us, but we're not really in tune with or applying the ultimate sacrifice. Yeah. We might have a nice Sunday and go home and feel that was nice, and we're probably no different to the Jews of the Old Testament. It might give us a boost for a few days, but it hasn't dealt with the issue of sin in our hearts that Jesus has dealt with.
Yeah. I'm actually listening to just a side issue of podcasts and of people from an Orthodox tradition and getting their perspective on some stuff.
Good on you. That's such a Phil thing to do.
Yeah. And one of the persons sort of said, one of the priests, he gets asked, well, what's the important part of the church service? Is it okay that I miss the beginning of the service and just get to reading of the Gospels or to the homily, or which part is the important part? And he says, all of it.
All of it. It's all significant.
It is all where God comes down and meets you in that place. And so you can't miss any of it.
No, you can't. Definitely. You cannot miss any of it.
Yeah.
And that's what we're going to see, I think, probably in the next chapter where he's talking about the significance of the church. Yeah. Absolutely. So he finishes the first half of chapter 9 after explaining all these rules, saying, look, it was all falling short. It was all incomplete or not capable of completely dealing with sins. It was all largely physical regulations. So verse 11, he says, so because of that, Christ has now become the high priest over all the good things that have come. And he has entered that greater, more perfect tabernacle in heaven, which wasn't made by human hands and is not part of this created world. We won't go through all that because I kind of touched on that in yesterday's episode. Well, we touched on that in yesterday's episode about what it means that Jesus has now gone into the actual temple that the one on the earth, this little tabernacle we just read about, represents.
Sorry, I've just sort of got a question in my mind. Is the perfect sanctuary in heaven not made by human hands and not part of this created world? So was it there before creation?
Yeah, that seems to be the indication, doesn't it? That this is an eternal...
And is it a created place, or was it there in part of the Godhead?
Ah, okay.
I'm just really being...
Yeah, no, well, that's a really good philosophical question.
Yeah, so it was-
I would expect, my best guess is that everything other than the Godhead, everything other than God himself, Father, Son, and Spirit, is created, including the tabernacle in heaven.
Yeah.
Because I think so.
Yeah.
But that's probably beyond my pay grade. But I think so, because the only thing that pre-exists eternally is the Godhead himself.
Yeah.
But nonetheless, it certainly predates and surpasses the earthly one. And the point he's making here is the earthly one is a shadow and a copy of this heavenly one. And Jesus went into the heavenly one and does his ministry there.
Yeah. It says in verse 12, it says, once for all time he took the blood into the most holy place, so into heaven's temple, but not the blood of goats and calves. He took his own blood. With it he secured our salvation forever. That's like our salvation is secured.
Secured forever.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And you're thinking, it's just off air, we were talking about this, and you're thinking about suggesting we have a conversation around what does a sacrifice do?
Yeah.
Is that what you meant? Like,
yeah,
how does it work? Yeah. And I think it's probably, I have touched on this before. Last year we did it, I think I did it with Jeff Baxter talking about Leviticus. But this is sort of a fairly fresh revelation to me as I've done some study in my master's on atonement and different things and just preparing for that. And I think I've come to realize that the things or the way that I thought animal sacrifice worked in the Old Testament and Jesus' sacrifice works in the New Testament is, I wouldn't say wrong, but I would say incomplete at best. So if I was to say to you, what happens when Jesus, let's not talk about Jesus for a minute, let's talk about the animal sacrifice. Let's say, Phil, you're living in the desert in the time of Moses, and you walk up to the temple to offer your sacrifice. Let me rephrase it again. Let's say it's the Day of Atonement. Let's keep it on the same thought that's here. It's the Day of Atonement, and you're standing at the front of Moses' tabernacle, and Aaron comes out, the high priest comes out, and he slaughters an animal, and he does something with that animal. Okay, what happens with that animal is that they send out one of them into the desert. The scapegoat goes into the desert, and all the sin is actually not on the animal. In the case of the Day of the Atonement, which one of those two animals is regarded as the sinful one?
The one that's gone into the desert.
Yeah, not the one that dies. The one that dies is perfect. The one that goes into the desert is the one that has all the sins confessed over it, to be taken out into the desert. So for the sake of the Day of the Atonement, this animal that is sacrificed that will ultimately go into the presence of God, it's not seen as a sin sacrifice. Leviticus says time and time again that the life of the flesh is in the blood. So what would happen is the priest would confess over the scapegoat, the sins. They basically transfer the sins of all of people into that animal, and that animal would go out. The other one would become a representative animal for all of the people. And what happens is, because that animal represents the people, it does still have it does represent a degree of sinfulness or uncleanliness. And it's important for the people to remember that you can't just rock up into the Holy of Holies. Our sinfulness prevents us going in. There's only one way into the Holy of Holies, and that's through death. So if you and I were to walk into the Holy of Holies, what happens?
No, we'd be killed.
We deserve to die. That's the analogy. So
Raiders,
what happens?
Raiders of the Lost Ark.
Raiders of the Lost Ark, exactly, yeah. Your face melts off.
For those old people
Yeah, exactly. It didn't work for me the other day here at Thirroul when I was did I tell you that story?
Yes.
Yes, so this poor girl, I said Raiders of the Lost Ark, she still didn't understand, so she thought the ark was something. How did they carry that ark on their shoulders? That's a big boat.
Yes.
So, but in this case, this animal, this one that is not the scapegoat, the one that will be killed, it still needed to die. But the difference was you and I are now represented by the animal. Now, that animal, in order to get into God's presence, it has to die. But when it dies, its blood goes into God's presence. Here's the big clincher. The process of sacrifice, this is different to every other culture. You and I are actually alive in that blood. Life is in the blood. And that animal has died in our place, but as a picture of resurrection, the blood is still alive. It is still speaking. The blood is still talking. And the Bible talks a lot about the concept of blood speaking. That blood is still alive, and you and me and all the people of Israel, we are all existing in that blood. Guess where we get to go?
Into the Holy of Holies.
Into God's presence. So that Day of Atonement shows how we can all go into God's presence. Now, if you overlay that on Hebrews and what Jesus has done, when Jesus offered his blood in our place, we are alive in his blood. We have been washed in his blood. This is all this blood terminology. We are alive in him. When he offered his blood once and for all, that's why it's secure. He doesn't have to keep offering it. You and I, we are now able to have access to the eternal inheritance throne room because we are alive in Christ's blood, because we have identified with what Christ has done in the same way that those Jews who came to the entrance to the tabernacle and took a day off from everything for the Day of Atonement, they identified with that animal. We identify with Christ, and now we have open access to the heavenly realm. Did I kind of half explain that?
Oh, well, I must have known, you explained it to me. Well, I could understand. Well, so I was like, wow. I hadn't quite, I knew that, it was like no forgiveness without the sacrifice of blood, and that our sins were paid for, but I didn't realise that life was in the blood that goes into the Holy of Holies, that goes into God's presence through Christ. I just thought it was he did it over there, like
something separate,
and we get the benefit of it, but I'm still here.
So we identify with the blood in a much closer way than we first thought, than we've probably been led to believe.
Because over the years, I'm going to, from like my upbringing and listening and all that, is like, well, it's like it's a sacrifice for our sins, and it's like, well, okay, it's done and it's finished, and then Jesus is his blood, he died for us and his blood was shed. To me, that was like ancient history.
Yes, that's right.
A little bit like ancient history. It's like, okay, that helped me.
A one-time thing.
Yeah,
it was dealt with,
and now I'm living on this other side.
But can you see here in the Hebrews, he's talking about it as a one-term thing, but it's a thing that's still happening. Jesus is still ministering. It's even though it happened one time, its efficacy is continuing eternally. It's always working. It's not that it isn't working. It's always there. I think we benefit from that. And also, too, if you think about it from the Eucharist, from the communion, you start to realize that when Jesus says, take and drink this is my blood, we are taking into ourselves the blood of Christ, not literal blood, but what it represents, the life of Christ. And by doing so, we're identifying with that blood. So that blood is cleansing us, but we're identifying with that blood. So that's why the Eucharist throughout church history has been regarded as the center, the most pivotal moment, because it's the thing that most vividly replaces the Day of Atonement.
Yeah.
Every time we take communion, we are reminding ourselves of the efficacy of Jesus and how much greater that is than the Jewish Day of Atonement. And it's open access into the presence of God. It's the thing that brings us in. His death and his offering of his blood in heaven brings us into his presence because we go with him through his blood. It's incredibly rich in metaphors, but I think it's worth exploring.
So much more. Sorry, then can we get rid of the awful communion little cup things that we've got then? Because they're so... Because there's...
I want to get rid of those things, Phil.
But what do we replace it with to make it so much more special?
Less noisy and less...
or make it more special.
Yes, it's
more
right.
reverence.
Yes, there has to be a reverence to it.
Awe and reverence.
Yeah. And it's not that we can't have it, but a lot of it is what we represent. I mean, you can go through the motion and go at the front and do all the thing that in the high Anglican church and still be empty of power because it's what it represents. I can imagine that on the Day of Atonement or when people are bringing their sacrifices in the Old Testament, it means more to some than others. Yeah. So we still owe it to the Lord to focus on this stuff ourselves, I suppose. Yeah.
Wow, that's powerful. So it does say there in verse 28, so it's like Christ died only once as a sacrifice to take away the sins of many people. I love this next part. He will come again, not to deal with our sins again. It's been
Yep,
done.
that's
dealt
been
with.
done with.
This time he will bring salvation to all those who are eagerly waiting for him.
And that's a
Definitely
little nudge at the end to say, hey, remember, guys, you're thinking about going back to Jewishness. Don't.
Yeah.
Because if he comes back and you're not eagerly waiting for him, but if you are eagerly waiting for him, you can expect to be welcomed in.
And it's so much more than the old system. It's
Yes, so much better.
repeated so much. It's like the old system's done away with. It's a mirror reflection of what the heavenly temple is going to be. Is
Absolutely.
So that's a positive note to
Finish it off
this
on.
one.
Hopeful. All right. Well, the story continues. The theme continues. The single train of thought continues.
Yes.
In chapter 10.
Yes.
I didn't say chapter 11. We'll come to that.
Yep.
Chapter 10 now. Talk to you on tomorrow's episode.
Sounds good.
Thanks for listening to this episode of The Bible. Wait, what? Be sure to subscribe wherever you listen to your podcast so you don't miss a single episode. And you can also find us on all the socials. Just search The Bible. Wait, what? And to find out more about our church, just search C3 Camden, C3 Picton, or C3 Thirroul on the web or on the socials. Thanks for being with us today, and we look forward to talking to you on the next episode of The Bible. Wait, what?